Hello, my name is Rocco Jones, and my senior research project is on media bias and why it is important to be informed and knowledgeable. So to begin, what is the purpose of this presentation? It's about media bias and the different types, where the information is actually coming from, and is that information trustworthy, and then preference in networks. So as I said, there's many different types of media biases and many ways to go about identifying them. One approach is morals and how writers' beliefs come into play with the media, as well as how they can affect readers' overall thought processes. Reporters can also spin and twist stories to try to create a more memorable one. My paper provides examples of different types of biases and explains how important competition is among media sources. Sometimes competition can reduce bias, but sometimes it can make it even spin a story even more. So, next up, there's a few terms that go with media bias, but before I jump into those, in today's world, a lot of people are using the internet and the media as their main source of news. With this form of media, there's plenty of bias and opinionated content. And to bring another thing to attention would be just how much is bias a factor when discovering a story, and just to notice how it changes. The best way to start is to pay attention to certain news networks that are portraying the same story, but it might be a completely different message. So to actually focus on these terms, first, what exactly is bias? Bias is offering a partial perspective on facts, which often can be up for debate. The three main types of bias, the first one being selection bias. And gatekeeping really is just the process of selecting a story and then filtering, monitoring, and editing the so-called reality of that story. With coverage bias, it's the time and space a specific story will have on air, and you can tell simply by seeing the stories they choose to report, and then how they analyze and how much time each story actually has on their network. That often shows where their priorities are at, of the gatekeepers and where their priorities are at. And then the third and final main point of bias is statement bias, and that is simply expressing either more favorable or unfavorable statements for a specific party. You can observe and notice this type of bias by looking at statements mentioning different types of people. Next up is just some questions I asked before the research. The first one being, why do we think mainstream media is becoming more negative and entertainment oriented more than factual? And should you trust information provided by the media? And then the second question, is there a specific bias towards certain networks and parties? Next up is the methodology. So I used an online survey, and this online survey for my project was distributed online through email to students that are in social media communication classes at Youngstown State University. Students made and sent a survey link to 185 college students. Over 50% were male, and the remaining were female. And the average age participated in this survey was 21 years of age, but it ranged from 18 to 24. And the students that participated, they earned points for the creation and the participation of this survey. Next up, I'll talk about the results. But before I jump into the results, the first page of that online survey included a consent form in which they must agree before participating. The second page asks about their gender, race, and age. And, just some questions that were asked in the project are, have they watched and paid attention to the news? And that was used on a 4-point scale, 4 being a lot, 3 being some, 2 being very little, and 1 being none. And that scale was used for majority of my questions. If the students answered yes to watching the news or pay attention to the news, students were also asked to participate in the full survey about which network they preferred. Some of those being Fox, CNN, ABC News, NBC News. And then the fourth page asked where they believe most Americans get their news from, TV, the radio, the newspapers, or the web, and if participants think that the media bias could ever be reduced or even fixed. And that was based on a 3-point scale, 0 being no, 1 being maybe, and 2 being yes. And then we'll just jump right in to the results. For the first one, it was how much attention do you pay to the news? As you can see, an overwhelming 51% of students said they do not pay attention to the news, where in second, 30.3% agreed that they watch the news very little, and 11% admitted they watch it a lot, and 7% admitted they only watch some. So as you can see, some of these students might not even know that bias is actually occurring if you're not paying a lot of attention to the news to be able to tell certain biases and how it is occurring. Obviously, you have to pay attention to the news. And then the next question was, if you do watch the news, which network do you prefer? And as we can see, an overwhelming 29% said that they prefer Fox as their main source of news, with CNN coming in second, and NBC News coming in third, ABC News coming in fourth, and then PBS, NPR, and MSNBC filling out the remaining slots in that graph. Then the next question that they were asked in the survey is, do you believe bias in the media can be removed? 60% of students actually said no. They believe that media bias cannot be removed, which to me shows that not only is it a problem, but people are aware that it's a problem, and they also think it's a bigger problem than certain people are making it out to be, because they believe it cannot be removed because of writers, beliefs and morals, and editors, the way that their, values come into play. And then, 25% said maybe they believe it could possibly be removed. 15% think yes, that it can be fixed or removed. The next results ask the question, have you ever noticed any type of bias in the news? 63% of students noticed a lot of bias in the news, while 28% noticed some, and the remaining slots in the graph, which were the minority, believe very little or none of news bias is a factor. And then I asked this question next for them. Considering your experience with this kind of information provided by the media, how likely are you to recommend a friend, colleague, to trust the information provided by the media? As you can see, it was used on a 10-point scale. 1 being they are very unlikely to trust information by the media, and 10 being they are very likely to trust information by the media. So, as you can see, an overwhelming 32 students, 17%, believe that they are very unlikely to recommend information by the media. And then as you see, there's a lot of people right in the middle where they're kind of on the fence, which to me shows that they trust information by the media and they're willing to share it, but not a whole lot. Like, it depends on the story and the situation and how they feel, because they're not, in this category where they're very unlikely, but they're also not very likely. So to me, that just says that they know bias is occurring, and it depends on the situation or the story. Because overwhelmingly, majority of the students are in the 3, 4, 5, and 6 slot, which is right about the average. And then, and one of the very last parts of this study, how biased do you think media sources are towards each of the following parties? We have Democrats, Republicans, people of color, and the blue is a lot, the red is some, the yellow is very little, and the green is not at all. So for Democrats, an overwhelming majority, over 100 students, believe they are very biased towards Democrats. Some students think some, and very little students believe that they are only a very little bias, and almost no students believe none at all. And then for Republicans, a little under 100 believe that they are very biased towards Republicans. Around 70 believe that they are somewhat biased. Around 25 believe they are very little, and only a handful of students believe they are not biased towards Republicans at all. And then for people of color, almost 100 students believe a lot of bias happens for people of color. Around 65, 70 believe some bias happens, and to round out the bottom, very little bias occurs. To about 20 of the students believe that, and then only a handful of students again believe that no bias occurs at all with people of color. And then next up is just the discussion and the conclusion. So overwhelmingly, students' results say that they agree there is a noticeable bias. It shows that in addition to having those networks preferences, there normally comes a specific point of view from those channels that are biased towards one side of the story. Majority of the participants believe media bias can't be removed, and I thought was a surprising finding, showing there might be a bigger issue than people are willing to admit. And the findings also show the majority of participants notice bias in the media, and specifically towards the parties, and noticeable during elections more so than not. But participants also share that they have noticed types of false information provided by the media and by those networks, and showing that even the mainstream media outlets can produce misleading headlines and overall misleading information at times. And one of the most interesting points of this study was an overwhelmingly 72% of students admitted they are unlikely to pass information provided by the media because they are unsure of what is actually true and what is false. And the last key findings of this study were not surprising. Most participants agreed that they noticed bias towards specific parties. And then for the limitations in this study, I guess the sample size could be a limitation, only 185 students. And then you could say that maybe another limitation was that it was only focused on communication study students, and also the age range. There might be difference of opinions if the age range was higher than 18 to 24 college students. So those are things to also keep in mind. And then in conclusion, we talked about what actually is bias and what causes it and what are the main terms that go with it. We also talked about the methodology, how an online survey was used, and how 185 college students at Youngstown State University participated. We also talked about all the results and the findings that came with the study, how most students believed bias couldn't be removed, and how there's specific biases towards parties and also people of color, and how they prefer certain networks and how they believe certain networks portray different messages within the same story. And I just thought this study was really interesting because it brought attention to college students that media bias is something that is an issue and an ongoing problem and needs to be further addressed, so we can get back to accurate news and reporting, and not just news that gets just media a lot of attention. And we need to get back to actual just fact reporting. And yeah, that's pretty much it for my presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for listening.